The standoff continues. Military vehicles moving round the compound, keeping the pressure on. Those inside, including it's thought around a dozen Britons, face questions, charges, and some of them the death penalty for killing 4 agents and wounding 18. But first, they have to come out or be forced out. Bill Neely, ITN, Waco, Texas.
Part 1. Origins. Even in the earliest stages of humanity's primitive past, most communities had a priesthood of elders at their core. These abstract yet influential figures served as the guiding light of each unified culture. They've always been the gatekeepers to the spiritual world, the representatives of the values and ethics of the people, and the counselors of the masses. Though these lofty aims are usually revered as dignified and honorable, history actually paints a strange and often controversial picture when it comes to the true nature of religion. Has the Church ultimately aided humanity's growth, or kept society under the deep sleep of hidden control for darker forces seeking power? The answer may lie somewhere in between, but to understand the full impact of this powerful force, we must first rediscover its tribal origins, shamanism, and early religious rites. Man's attraction to ritual and tradition can be traced back as far as recorded history shows us. Sacred rites, rules, social hierarchies, and artworks have all been a defining part of the fabric that makes up human history. There's no pure consensus on the origin of religion among scholars. However, before there were grandiose cathedrals with bell towers and brimstone, we see traces of unified culture shaping the landscape of civilization. Paleolithic religious rites, such as complex burial ceremonies and procedures, point to the belief in an afterlife, consistent across several early cultures. Ancient depictions of half-man, half-animal beings inscribed on cave walls were the creation of cults who were dabbling in an animistic worldview. These metaphysical pioneers were tempting fate, hoping to uncover some hidden layer to understand the causal nature of their world. Findings at Neolithic sites like Göbekli Tepe lead researchers to believe that an advanced social hierarchy and religious system were the basis for the rise of agriculture and animal husbandry. This monumental paradigm directly set the stage for humans up to sustain large societies, build wealth, and undertake major projects with greater efficiency over time. This association between centralized systems of resource management is at the core of religion, even in today's world. These same economic conditions would also become the pretext for the creation of government in order to manage these resources under a different form of hierarchy. This dynamic has placed the church and state in a power struggle since the dawn of modern civilization. Primitive mystic and shamanic traditions practiced independently would give way to more collective and dogmatic iterations of religious philosophy around 900 to 200 BCE. The Jain tradition of India is the earliest well-documented school of religious thought. The Jain believed in adherence to a strict code of nonviolence and asceticism. As far as we know, this was the first collective monastic code of morals and ethics practiced on a widespread basis. During the Bronze Age, a more refined deification of the natural world began to take shape. Recurring symbolism venerating the sun became extremely prominent during this period. It is as though man went from a state of looking for an invisible force behind nature to experiencing divinity through the phenomenon of nature itself. This shift leads to the formation of a meticulous pantheon of gods, each god having material things attributed to their influence, such as planets, the success of a harvest, favor in battle, etc. The Iron Age was filled with traces of major religious cult activity. The Celtic and Germanic and Slavic polytheists were some of the most prominent pagan cultures at this time. In the reports about Celtic tradition given by the Greeks and Romans, we hear about what may be one of the earliest examples of an elite priest class in the Western world. The mysterious characters known as the Druids were said to be the high elders, or experts of this early pagan belief structure and divinatory practice. Like the gurus and yogis of the East, these Druids were not only religious figures, but extremely important characters in Celtic society. Some were in the fields of politics, medicine, record-keeping, and even law. When the Romans conquered Gaul, Julius Caesar overlaid their own pagan belief structure over the Celts' traditions. Though the Celts actually worshipped the forces of nature, the Romans attributed these influences to gods from their pantheon, such as Mercury, Minerva, and Apollo. During the Christianization that came later, many Druids were converted to monks and became influential within the church. Being absorbed within this conquering power's ranks to help convert their disciples and perhaps quell revolutionary sentiments. Were the Druids using the Celtic religion and their influence as a means to control society? Or were they merely well-respected practitioners of these old belief systems? There is no denying that religion has shaped the world we live in today. The remnants of tribal longings deep within the human psyche have created radical social consequences throughout history. Dissenters were always treated as outcasts, cut off from the economic and political benefits of the tribe for their heresy. This same attitude of the co-opted masses has stunted social and technological growth and even enabled atrocities. Persecution has opposed civil liberties since the beginning of religious practice and has been used as a tool by tyrants. Intolerance is one of the key elements that has caused religion to remain at the center of cultures throughout history. Nonconformity and free thinking have always been the exception and not the rule in the human condition. Individuals and spiritual countercultures have faced discrimination, hatred, and even religious cleansing or murder based on their beliefs and differences with the status quo. The unholy union of the church and state would become the vehicle for warfare, mass social control, and even genocide. Once leaders discovered the powerful influence of the religious dogma over masses, they would leverage its disciples for political gain and imperial conquest. The two forces would never fully separate after this. Is the church merely a tool of the world's governments to control the minds and resources of its people? Or would these two groups have wars among themselves? The concept of state-sponsored religion goes all the way back to ancient Egyptian and Sumerian cultures. Here, the temples were a vehicle for collecting tax revenue through sanctioned services like prostitution. In many cases, the spiritual leaders and figures of the rulership were indistinguishable from one another. This is also where the idea of the divine right of kings comes from. The idea that these rulers were preordained by divinity is an invention of the rulers themselves. In Persia, around the 6th century BC, Zoroastrianism became the religion of the state. Its dualistic teachings created a framework for social policing with the motto, "Good thoughts, good words, good deeds." The idea that there was a system of creating productive members of society seemed to be the motivation behind the Zoroastrian experiment, and it worked pretty well until Persia was conquered later in the 7th century AD. Of the many governments experimenting in the field, it was the Romans who first mastered the art of using religion to implement social control, an endeavor with consequences that can still be seen today through the Vatican's prestigious place in modern society. The Romans ordained the emperor as Pontifex Maximus, a title which mandated his worship as a god in Roman society. The disobedience of this rule could even result in Roman citizens being put to death. This made it apparent that the state had a clear view of religion. It doesn't matter what you think, because we will tell you what you are allowed to believe. In the days of the Roman Empire, countless Christians and Jews were put to death in public displays of power, like sacrifices to Roman gods for sport. This dark practice was an early warning sign of how dangerous religious beliefs could truly become. The Crusades were a series of religious expeditions and wars fought on behalf of the Latin Church starting around 1095 AD. The main objective of the initial Crusades was to regain the Holy Land from the Muslims. Pope Urban II rallied for military support of the Byzantine Empire, who was in the midst of the battle with migrating Turks in Anatolia. Western Europeans responded strongly to these sentiments, and many volunteered for the cause. Many of those involved also had ulterior motives because they saw an opportunity to profit or gain influence from their involvement. Shortly after this, 4 Crusader states were formed in the county of Edessa, the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, and the county of Tripoli. After the first 200 violent years of Crusades, Muslim dominance of the Holy Land hadn't been changed. It wasn't until the 1450s that Constantinople had finally been toppled, and Christian-Islamic relations haven't improved much since. This near 400-year period was filled with crime and injustice, all masquerading as religious conquest. Crusaders pillaged many of the places they went, and early German Christian crusaders even massacred Jews in 1096. The war also targeted pagans and heretics. No one was safe from the militant agenda of the Church to conquer, reform, and cleanse the Holy Land. At the siege of Antioch, Crusaders killed Muslims, Greek Christians, and Syrians indiscriminately. After leaving a bloodbath, Crusaders often took religious artifacts as trophies. The Knights Hospitaller and the Knights Templar were literally the Latin Church's own private army during this period. They were bought and paid for with land and resources acquired by the Pope, and the Templars became one of the wealthiest groups in Europe. They would later fall out of favor with the Church and be disbanded by Pope Clement V on trumped-up charges of sodomy, magic, and heresy. In truth, they were in political conflict with Philip IV of France, who pressured the Pope. Strange how quick loyalty and alliances can shift in the world of the Church. Did the Church simply exist to serve the political agenda of the state? Or were factions within the Church slowly gaining ground in their own agenda to gain greater control of political influence and resources? Believe it or not, the Crusades were just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to the brutality the Church would put on display around this time. Pretty much given free rein by the government, the Catholic Church would carry out its most grisly endeavor yet. In 12th century France, the Inquisition was launched as the Church's attempt to squash any dissent of their draconian policies, and they planned to do so by any means necessary. This war on heretics involved a series of investigations and tribunals of the accused. Though some of the accused got off easy, those deemed to be unrepentant heretics were handed over to local authorities and in most cases burned at the stake, exiled, or imprisoned for life. The main reason for such harsh action was the Church's fear about the rise of Catharism and Waldensianism, which they felt could threaten their existence. Pope Innocent IV's papal bull Ad Extirpanda in 1252 decreed that getting confessions from heretics was to be accomplished at all costs. The order explicitly condoned the use of torture if necessary. The inquisitors were even granted absolution from the acts of torture they were instructed to perform. These inquisitions were carried out by the Franciscan and Dominican orders within the Church. The Inquisitions would last well into the 1600s in different waves all over the world. Was the Church just a way for cults of power-hungry men to steal wealth, imprison political enemies, and secure authority by force? Or was there some redeeming light to man's original spiritual longings that was lost along the way? Perhaps this divine truth had simply fallen into the wrong hands. Part 2. Mythology. The Early Church. After centuries of persecution at the hands of the Roman establishment, Christianity gained a foothold in the empire after its widespread popularity caused Emperor Constantine to legalize it in the 4th century. Constantine said he had a strange dream of the Christian symbol of the cross as a symbol of victory. Though this is seen by some as a great moment of liberation from tyranny against the freedom of religious belief, the early Christians worked for social control just as soon as they arrived. They attacked the Gnostics and Montanists, accusing them of heresy. It was these same Christians of the newly state-sponsored religion who would later become radicalized to participate in the Crusades. The first major case of capital punishment for a heretic came in 385 when a wealthy Roman named Priscillian was put to death for being found guilty of the crime of magic. The early church had its fair share of political differences, especially between the Catholic and Orthodox groups. The Muslim conquest of the East and questionable practices by the church to exploit the public eventually led to unrest in certain circles. This would set the stage for the next chapter of Western religion. Would the virtues of religion finally overcome its manipulation? Or would the mass appeal of religion forever be a thin veil for the state's agenda for mass political consensus? During the 16th century, something pretty remarkable happened. A religious movement so powerful it could rival the creation of Christianity itself. Freshly after the monumental period of the Renaissance, a radical, free-thinking theologian published a document called 95 Theses. This powerful piece of alternative media called out the church for its corrupt practices, such as selling God's forgiveness in the form of indulgences. It also preached that salvation could not be earned by any means other than faith in the Christian narrative of Jesus. It worked pretty well. After the document was widely spread and debated, the Western Church was fractured into several smaller denominations, including the traditional Catholics, Lutherans, Anabaptists, and Unitarians. The movement became so widespread that it even converted the Church of England under Henry VIII. This major political blow to the Catholic Church left them reeling. They had to regain power and influence in Europe fast if they wanted to survive. It was in these desperate times that Catholicism was rebranded with the arrival of one of the most controversial groups of all time. At the start of the Counter-Reformation, the Catholics were looking to regain some ground, and they needed reinforcements badly. One man was up to the task. An enigmatic man named Ignatius Loyola came along and founded the Jesuits around 1540. Ignatius' social status as a nobleman and military background uniquely qualified him to launch a counterstrike, even going as far as to call Jesuits soldiers of God. Their radical reforms and humanist teachings won back several countries for Catholicism in Europe, including Poland. Of all the conspiracies involving the Church, perhaps none are more notorious than those involving the Jesuits. It is rumored that this hidden hand within Catholicism asserts its influence throughout the world in dubious ways. Spies, assassinations, blackmail, and extortion have riddled the stories from their checkered past. They are credited with protecting early Native Americans from slavery, which won them a favor in several Latin countries throughout the 16th century. Their rabid missionary work throughout the world, paired with their scholarship, accelerated globalism in a way never seen before, bringing civics to the Americas and new science to China. Many highly strategic political relationships were formed, cementing Catholic influence into the world of the future. This influence grew so fast that many established world leaders began to view the movement as a threat. And by the 1700s, the Jesuits came under harsh persecution in Europe and even expulsion from Loyola's native country of Spain in 1767. Even the Church itself turned its back on the order in 1773, when Pope Clement XIV decided they were no longer of political advantage to the Church, after years of service and bailing it out during the Reformation. Another ambiguous entity within the ranks of the Church began all the way back during the Crusades. The Knights Hospitaller went on to later become the Sovereign Military Order of Malta. The Church's private army never went away completely. Though the Knights of Malta present themselves as a charitable organization today, they've been linked to some pretty interesting individuals and political activities throughout history. There is no doubt that seditious political and even military means have been used by the Church to accomplish its goals. Does this still happen today, or has its influence gradually faded into the background? The current Pope, Francis, is a Jesuit. But do we see these shadowy figures in places of power elsewhere? Jesuit universities have a reputation for excellence and have attracted some of the most powerful people in their pursuit of knowledge. These individuals include American presidents William Jefferson Clinton, Lyndon B. Johnson, and Donald J. Trump. Billionaire philanthropist John Paul Getty, German idealist philosopher Martin Heidegger, film director Alfred Hitchcock, and American psychologist and writer Timothy Leary, along with countless other influential people. Due to the heavy involvement of Mormons in the CIA, it is speculated that the agency is also involved in recruiting from the Church of Latter-day Saints. Scientology is another religion with strict and bizarre rules that seems like the perfect breeding ground for social experimentation used in government mind control programs. Though this is mostly speculation, there is declassified evidence to show that the state has launched several initiatives in the past to co-opt modern organized religions and influence leadership. In the 60s, we began to see a revival of interest in primitive religious practices connected to the psychedelic movement. This included a growing interest in ancient Eastern religions, fascination with the occult, and the rise of neo-paganism. Some modern researchers now believe this was a coordinated initiative by powers within the state to dumb down the population and induce an archaic revival. Part 3. Legacy: The Atheist Movement. Atheism went from a derogatory term used to attack social outcasts in ancient Greece to a mainstream philosophy of contemporary culture in many parts of the developing world. Atheism began to pick up momentum in the 18th century Enlightenment period. The movement reached a fever pitch at the height of the French Revolution and finally gained some level of political influence. Atheism as a whole has also run the spectrum of human morality. Some atheists have extremely humanist values and seek to end the influence of religion used to start wars. We've also seen cases like the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, where predominantly atheist groups carried out some of the greatest atrocities in modern history. Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin said, "The idea of God implies the abdication of human reason and justice. It is the most decisive negation of human liberty, and necessarily ends in the enslavement of mankind in theory and practice." This radical idea of individual moral responsibility was something that in the Church was only reserved for monks at the highest levels. So why is it that the Church always perpetuates a state of mediocrity for fallen mankind, discouraging radical action to accomplish equilibrium in this life? They tell their followers divine retribution will redeem this permitted period of injustice and chaos. The terrifying question asked by atheists everywhere has always been, is this by design? It is interesting to note that U.S. states that have the highest concentration of atheists also have the lowest murder rates. Religion enables atrocities in the modern world that range from the government using the jihad narrative to resurrect Western conquest in the Middle East to shootings at houses of worship in modern America. Of all the nefarious uses for religious belief in the modern world, there are perhaps none more strange than the phenomenon of hieromania. Throughout history, men have always claimed to be prophets and angels sent by God to bring humanity divine knowledge. Many of these people were charlatans looking for people to take advantage of, and others have spawned the largest world religions, such as Jesus and the Buddha. In modern times, self-proclaimed prophets and religious leaders have come in the most dangerous and unusual form possible. Starting around the 1970s, religious cults were something that became more common as a response to the world's view of contemporary religion. Around 1974, a strange, charismatic man named Marshall Applewhite began a UFO-based religious cult called Heaven's Gate in San Diego, California. Like many cases of hieromania, this story would end with tragic consequences. Applewhite had his followers convinced that they were being prepared to be raptured by aliens. On March 26, 1997, police discovered 39 bodies in an apparent mass suicide induced by a cocktail of phenobarbital and applesauce mixed with vodka. What's really scary is that Applewhite and his partner in crime seemed to be very well read and developed a hoax so elaborate it seemed almost like a science experiment on people. A similar situation took place in 1978. The Jonestown Massacre of Guyana, South America, would forever stigmatize the effect of religion on the minds of vulnerable people. Another charismatic man named Jim Jones convinced his People's Temple followers to drink Kool-Aid laced with poison. Jones told his followers the government would never let them be free to practice their religious beliefs, and the only way out would be to be together in heaven. Though Jones had most likely fabricated these government threat accusations to avoid the consequences for his cult leader activities, there was another man whose followers were persecuted and even killed for their beliefs in 1993. David Koresh and his group, the Branch Davidians, came under attack in the early 1990s, and reports of radical activity involving firearms led to a federal investigation and ultimately the Waco siege of 1993. The Branch was a Seventh-day Adventist offshoot started back in the 50s. David Koresh became involved in the late 1980s when the group began to drift away from its traditional doctrine, and Koresh declared himself the final prophet. The ATF and Texas Army National Guard raided the Koreshian compound due to a suspected weapons violation, which led to a violent standoff, a gunfight that lasted 51 days, and ultimately the murder of 76 American citizens by their own government. The American government had the event widely broadcast to send a clear message to its people. We will decide what your religious freedoms truly are, and if you don't comply, we will take you down.
These people killed 4 federal officials in the line of duty. They were heavily armed. They fired on federal officials yesterday repeatedly, and they were never fired back on. David Koresh was dangerous, irrational, and probably insane.
Should people be allowed to declare themselves as religious leaders? Or will it end in tragedy, like it has for centuries in so many cases? It is extremely surprising that with all the advancement in modern science, centuries of empirical evidence, and religious corruption, that the vast majority of the world's population still chooses religion over atheism. So many religious groups disagree about the nature of God and His rules. Is the most logical explanation that the concept as a whole is an invention to explain what we don't yet understand about existence? There are current studies that suggest religion is genetically built into the human condition. One current hypothesis is that there may be a God gene which exists as the VMAT2 gene, resulting in individuals becoming predisposed to spiritual belief. Though there are no conclusive studies on this matter, man's interest in his own need to believe in something bigger than himself is a question which has captivated scientific thought for millennia. Science itself has become something of a religion due to its increasing institutional dogma. This is something many great thinkers in the philosophical idealist circles warned about. The rational positivism that pervades modern scientific theory has led to some very interesting discoveries, and yet left the most important questions unanswered. The diametric opposition between religion and science started all the way back in the Middle Ages, when the Church outlawed unsanctioned early scientific practices and alchemy as witchcraft. There is even evidence that the great thinker Archimedes could have brought calculus to the world back in the 10th century, but after falling out of favor with the Church and the Crown, he was murdered, his texts sequestered by monks, and the world would literally wait centuries before rediscovering calculus. If this one act of the church and state set us back hundreds of years in potential technological advancement, just imagine how many useful discoveries have been suppressed through the course of history. Internet technology and social media showed us the amazing potential for peace when Reddit founder Aaron Swartz used software and the internet to help stop an ideological war in Syria, in the most radical move of technological political activism seen since Luther used the printing press to start the Reformation. Where the greatest threats lie, there will always be men and women willing to fight evil. One day, these voices may be silenced completely through threats like internet censorship. Has the church really been a force of good in our world? Could a divine light of truth simply have fallen into the wrong hands at different times? Or is it all a complex system of social control used to enslave the masses for political gain? Decide for yourself. This is only the official story.